You know that moment when you're painting a portrait and everything feels like it's going pretty darn well. Like your brushwork looks good, it's expressive, you have this beautifully rendered eye, and then you step back and you realize the eyes don't match, or the whole face looks like somehow it's sliding down one side of the head. Yeah, that's what we're fixing today. I have a portrait that looks okay at first glance, but if I compare it to my reference, well, the proportions and thus the likeness are off. So I'm going to walk you through step by step how I overcome this, and it'll help you out whether you're running into an issue of mismatched eyes, a crooked smile, or proportions that just don't seem to match the person you're painting. If you're here, you've probably experienced this exact frustration. I mean, this is something I think every portrait painter has run into at one point or another, but in my experience working with artists who want to paint with bold, expressive brushwork, the kind that makes people stop and stare, well, the moment you start to loosen up, your drawing accuracy goes straight out the window. One eye ends up droopy, features don't quite match, and when the head is turned at an unusual angle, forget about it. Everything looks wonky. And here's the thing. This gets worse when you're working Alla Prima because you don't have that safety net of a pencil underdrawing to fall back on. But stick with me because by the end of this video, you're going to have a complete system for nailing proportions without ever picking up a pencil. Bonus, you won't need to use a grid or anything like that either. Plus, I made a free guide that breaks down exactly how to practice this so it becomes second nature. The link is in the description, but you can also scan here to make sure you get your copy. So, why do our facial proportions get all wonky the moment we start getting expressive with our mark making? Well, it's because we're thinking of the shapes of the face like a jigsaw puzzle. Every shape is ultimately arbitrary, and they fit together in a flat, arbitrary way. So as long as all of those shapes' edges meet, we're golden, right? Wrong. Well, sort of. So you can conceptualize the head in a 2D way, thinking of it like a bunch of jigsaw puzzle pieces coming together. But the head is, in fact, a three-dimensional shape, so it helps for us to conceptualize it in a three-dimensional way. That way, we can think both in terms of the 2D jigsaw pieces, those shapes of light and dark in the face and how they come together, and we can think of it in simple 3D forms that help us to make sure that everything matches and looks proportional. I learned this approach from the incredible Mildred Hankinson, who showed me how the Loomis Method applies beautifully to fine art portraiture. I wanted to learn from Millie specifically because she can not only create a beautiful portrait, she finds her drawings fast. And I mean really fast. Like, this is a 1-hour drawing fast. And this, just 20 minutes. And this one, just 5. I know, right? I wanted to be able to do that too. And in working with her, I learned that there's one key tool in her toolkit, and that's what I'm going to show you today. Once I put this to use, I started thinking like a sculptor instead of a puzzle solver. And that's really when everything changed as far as the ease of my portraits. The secret is using simple proportional landmarks. Think of them as an armature for your painting that you established first before you ever have to worry about expression or brushwork or even getting into the features themselves. Here's exactly how this works. So the basic proportions are incredibly simple, but they are game changers. First, we need to think of the head in simple 3D forms. The cranium, which we can simplify into a sphere, and then the mandible, which we can simplify into a sort of box. If you want help visualizing this, Millie shared an incredible visual analogy of thinking of the cranium and mandible together like popcorn spilling out of one of those classic red and white striped containers that you used to get at the movies. You know, before we got the huge popcorn buckets that were branded to whatever blockbuster had just come out. So the popcorn bucket is tapered a little bit, just like our jaws are. We just need to skew the proportion so the bucket's a little smaller and the dome of the popcorn is a little bit bigger, and then we have a 3D form that is proportionally similar to a human skull. So the first thing we need to do is imagine this on our subject, which I will do by drawing a circle to represent the sphere of the cranium. Then I'll add arcs to represent the meridians or equator of that sphere. I'll have one arc that represents the vertical plumb line dividing the face, and then another that runs neatly around the sides of the face. Already, this tells us a lot because the vertical arc shows us the right and left symmetry of the face, and this should coincide with things like the center of the bridge of the nose, etc. Then the other meridian we've drawn coincides with the placement of the front of the ear. But we don't stop there. Once we have this established, we could start laying in simple anchor points that will show us everything from the eye line, the brow line, the nose, and the lips. So all we have to do is build on what we've already put down. So first, let's talk about the proportions from the top of the head to the eye line, and then from the eye line to the bottom of the chin. That is a 1-to-1 ratio, so equal distances. So if we know where the top of the head is, and we know where the bottom of the chin or jaw is, we should know where the eyes are going. Now we have the second set of proportions. This is what really blew my mind when Millie shared this to me. So from the hairline to the brow line, and then from the brow line to the bottom of the nose, and then from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin, that is also 1-to-1-to-1, 3 equal sections. And then finally, if we take that very bottom section, so from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin, and we divide that in half, that gives you the bottom of the lower lip. For simplicity's sake, I can remember that the eye line is the halfway point from the crown of the head to the bottom of the jaw. The brow line is the halfway point of the sphere of the cranium. And once I have those 2 points, along with the top of the head and the bottom of the jaw, I can use my basic proportions to fill in everything else. But when I'm doing my initial block in, I'm not thinking about whether the mouth is beautiful or whether I'm capturing the exact color of the eyes. I'm thinking about these in terms of very simple geometric shapes and relationships. So I use very simple, easy to read lines to capture these landmarks first. I'm basically building the scaffolding or armature that everything else is going to hang on. The key here is to make these lines really crisp and clean and typically as thin as possible. So I'm not guessing about whether that bottom of the jaw coincides with the top of my line, the bottom of the line, or somewhere in the middle. So if I'm starting from scratch, I will often begin with an overall head shape. I'll think of it as an egg, slightly wider on top compared to the bottom. This is a simplification of the cranium plus mandible idea, which I can always go in and establish more clearly later if needed. Next, I establish that center line that I mentioned. This is crucial when the head is turned. This line follows the basic form of the face, but I don't get bogged down in having it trace like the shape of the nose or anything like that. A simple arc is just fine for the block in. Now I can drop in my eye line. Remember, from the top of the head to here, and then from here to the bottom of the chin should be equal distances. Next, I can either find my hairline or brow line and then use that to divide everything below that hairline into thirds. So hairline to brow line, 1/3, brow line to bottom of nose, 1/3, and then bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin is the final third. If I can see the sphere of the cranium clearly and can confidently divide that in half to get my brow line, I will do it. But if finding the hairline is easier, I might take that option. And finally, I get the last third and then I cut it in half to find the line that represents the very bottom of the lower lip. And look at that. I've got the foundation of accurate proportions and I haven't even started thinking about the features yet. The beauty of this approach is that these lines become my guardrails. As I develop the portrait and get more expressive with my brushwork, I can always check back against these fundamental relationships and make sure everything just logically and mathematically holds together. Now, one quick note on this before I move on, and that is that this, of course, is going to be most straightforward when you have a face that is perfectly square to you as the viewer. But the second we start to turn to one side, well, that right and left symmetry is going to feel like it shifts a little bit. Or, heaven forbid we have a pose where maybe the model is looking down and then you have foreshortening that occurs. And some of these proportions will start to look like they compress together. Same thing if you're looking like up and at an angle. The point here isn't to get out your proportional divider and get really painstaking about measuring these things. The idea is that it should essentially just pass the sniff test. Like just make sure that it looks like it's roughly in thirds when you consider the proportions. It's going to be easier to check this when you have that very simple armature versus once you're getting in all of those details of the individual features. Now, how can this help you if you are already working on a portrait where you aren't 100% confident on your proportions? I'll show you this tool in action right now, but make sure to grab that drawing exercise cheat sheet that I mentioned earlier because it has a full gamut of tools that you can check out to help you out in this situation. But for right now, let's talk about how these landmarks can help us problem solve a likeness that's a bit off. Okay, so here I have my painting in question side by side with my reference. I'll go ahead and quickly overlay our landmarks for this. So starting with the circle of the cranium, then we have the basic arcs or meridians of that cranium. You can also think of these as equator lines. Then we have that basic box shape of the mandible. And now we've divided the head into halves where the eye line comes at that halfway point. And now we can go ahead and use that. I'm using the equator of that cranium to get the brow line. And then I'm dividing the rest of this into thirds based on that to get the hairline, bottom of nose, and bottom of the jaw, which should coincide with the bottom of the mandible that I drew earlier. We divide these two in half to get bottom of the lower lip. And then just for yucks, I can put in that lip crease just above. This is a little bit below the halfway point between these. In fact, looking at this, I would say the upper lip is probably the halfway point between bottom of lower lip and bottom of the nose. And then I can just subdivide that further to get the crease of the lips that I got here. If I copy and paste this over onto the image of my painting, suddenly now I can see where I've gone astray. So my chin, lips, and nose are all pretty much in the right spot, but the eye line has come down substantially. So notice how instead of the corners of the eyes all intersecting this green line here in the reference, now all four corners of the eyes are sitting well below this line. Similarly, the brow is setting well below the brow line, and the hairline has come down just a little bit too. What's great about this is all I had to do is just literally copy the exact shapes from my reference to my painting and just adjust it so that it fits proportionally on here. And it's so easy to tell those differences. Now, this is pretty easy in something like Photoshop, but if you are watching this thinking, okay, Chelsea, that's great, but I don't know the first thing about Photoshop, don't worry. You can do this the exact same way, completely analog. All you need to do is make sure that your reference is the same size as your portrait. That is the only starting piece that's really essential, because then you can simply use tracing paper over the reference to get this same wireframe, the same armature that we've been talking about. Then simply just take your tracing paper and hold it over top your painting, provided the painting is dry enough, and you can get the exact same effect. You can also do this exact same thing with something like a clear plastic sheet, plexiglass, an actual sheet of glass, provided you're careful in handling it and are careful not to put it directly on top of the wet painting. You want to make sure you have some sort of spacer between whatever your tracing paper or plastic or glass is, again, so that if your painting is wet, it's not going to smear. But honestly, once you get comfortable with these proportional relationships, you'll find that you'll actually need to use a tool like tracing paper or a clear sheet of glass to check this less and less. So here's what I really want you to understand. You can have expressive brushwork and accuracy. You don't have to choose between the two. The secret is building your proportions like a sculptor would, establishing the underlying structure first, then adding the expressive details on top of that solid foundation. When you approach it this way, you can be as loose and painterly as you want with your brushwork because you know the bones of the portrait are solid. And don't worry, if this doesn't come naturally to you, it did not always come naturally for me either. In fact, I have this very vivid memory from my very first art class when I was in kindergarten. My art teacher, I don't even remember her name anymore, but I do remember this experience. She wanted to teach us to draw using basic shapes like this, but I already loved drawing, and so I was able to do it without using her approach. And so I said I wasn't going to do that. And I remember she actually told my parents that she didn't see a future in art for me if I wasn't willing to learn this method. Go figure. But that's just to say, I was really comfortable with the 2D approach of thinking of everything like puzzle pieces for a really long time, like decades long time. But once I was comfortable enough with that, incorporating this 3D perspective actually felt like a really natural evolution. So even now, when I get proportions off, it's less dramatic than it used to be, and it's much easier to fix. So now that you know where everything should go, the next step is learning how to actually set it down on canvas with confidence. That's your block in technique. And honestly, that's where most portraits either soar or crash completely. So that's exactly what I'm going to be covering in next week's video. But between now and then, if you want to really nail this proportional approach, I've created a free guide with my favorite exercises to improve your drawing skills. It includes some video demos for every exercise so you can easily follow along. The link is in the description below. Grab it, try these techniques on your next portrait, and let me know in the comments how it goes. Remember, you've got this. I have helped hundreds of painters through this exact process, and I know you can master it too. Now go make something beautiful.